Good evening, everybody. So for tonight's presentation, I was going to extrapolate on my first presentation regarding code switching between professional and more casual environments. And the way I was going to do it was by using some different terms that we've learned in the back half of this course. So we will begin with a recap of what I did in the first presentation. So in the first presentation, I used two different examples. I used an email I sent as a job application and a text I had with my friend on a pretty normal Saturday night. And the way I contrasted those two is I showed how um, not just me, but I believe people in many environments ch almost change their personas, whether it be when they're emailing someone for a job application or sending a text message in order to fit the second term here, a linguistic ideology that they believe is acceptable and, will lead to better performance on things like a job application. So today we're going to move on to discuss three terms. The first is indexicality. We're going to discuss how those different forms of language, such as what I used in the email to a boss versus a text, and how the email to a boss might index some more professional things, maybe like that I'm below him in the rank of the office, and how those text messages might leave a more casual relationship where it's a little more equal in things like social stance. Language ideologies is something we've obviously studied ad nauseum over the back half of this back half of this course. I think this one will be pretty cut and dry. It just reviews how professional work environments value things like professionalism, being on time versus your friends don't really care if you're wearing a suit when you hang out with them. It's more of just casualness, ease, and being calm and things like that. I think those two things and the way they are different are really important. For that, I actually interviewed my father. We had a conversation regarding like professional interviews, and I'm excited to talk about that. So we'll get into that later. And then the last one I'm also excited about, which is Bauman and Briggs's intextualization and recontextualization. So the way I'm going to do that is use a piece of feedback I actually received from Mahira in relation to my first presentation, which is how do these ideas of code switching um, move into the sphere of social media? Because that is obviously a sphere that is constantly expanding in today's world. So we're going to get into that at the end of the presentation. I will begin with indexicality. So indexicality is referenced in many different readings throughout the semester. One that I definitely took it away from was Susan Sizer and the uses of obscenity in live stand-up comedy. Um, Essentially, indexicality references how linguistic text, whether it be speaking from in front of a comedy club, an email, a message, how does that index some form of social identity, intimacy, power dynamics, etc. What do I mean by that? So the formal email I referenced before that I sent as a job application indexes things like professionalism and respect. It refers to ideas of whether it be thank you for your time and consideration at the end of the email, or indents within the paragraphs, or overall just a more respectable tone. I think that definitely indexes like a upward social stance in the way that you're looking to win them over or gain their respect or something like that. I think the difference with a text is it definitely indexes a more like peer group relationship. I know I referenced this on the first slide, but it indexes a relationship in which it's much more casual, obviously, much more even between the two and not the same. It does not index the same things as professionalism and respect. So why is this important? I think it shows that code switching and these ideas of changing your personality and your tone of language and the way you behave around other people is not really random. It's more determined by the way we relate to each other, by the way we respect someone we're sending a job application to a different way than it's not like we don't respect our friends. It's more like we just simply discuss these forms of respect and say it in different ways. So I think those different terms of language are important, and what they index is important in this context. Second, uh, we're going to get into the screenshot at the bottom in a second, but I used language ideologies as my second term. This was a term that was introduced by John B. Haviland and Patrick Eisenlohr in Unit 10 to 15. For me, this term essentially just leads on and means the ways that different spheres of life, whether it be professionalism, social the way I'm going to use the comparisons here is an interview with a boss versus a conversation with a friend. Tone, professionalism, being on time, using proper English are valued at work. Casualness and ease, things like that, obviously that I mentioned in the first slide, are more valued in casual conversations. So the below is just a text that I thought was funny that I got the other day, where one of my buddies was making a joke about, you know, it was some joke for some variation of about a basketball game and throwing a punch and something like that. And this is a joke in relation to a fight that the Golden State Warriors had last year in which Draymond Green punched Jordan Poole. So I just thought that was funny, and I think that demonstrates how texts are sent with a much more casual and like ease mindset than something else. This leads me to my first interview, which was with my dad. You can see him in the bottom corner. He's a very established shoulder surgeon, someone I obviously have immense respect for. So my question to him was, when having an interview, correspondence with professional people, and things like interviews, how important is those forms of professionalism? Obviously that's extremely repetitive in that question. I didn't ask the question that way, but how important is showing up, being on time, using proper English? And something he's always taught me is when you show up to those interviews, if you're not going to show up with, you know, to the point, showing respect for the person that's interviewing you, things like that, you're doing yourself and that person a disservice. Your actions are disrespectful, and you probably should not even be there in the first place. So I think just those forms of ideologies of like what is seen as professional and what is seen as casual, such as like I would never use the term yeah in an interview. I would use yes, or if they asked me how I was doing, I would not say good, I would say I was doing well. I think those are just two examples of how those things relate in this context. And then lastly, one of the comments I got on my first presentation was, I thought it was an excellent point of feedback, was how does this relate to social media? So something I tried to look into when I was building this presentation was how social media relates to these ideas of professionalism, casualness, and code switching between the two, whether it be in a professional or a casual relationship. So I think the best example and the example that came to my mind was social media and posts on Instagram when I think about this. So when I've applied for jobs previously, if I say had a public Twitter account or a public Instagram account, I would make sure to trim those Instagram accounts to make sure there was no form of image or text that could be interpreted in a way that would diminish my chance at that job application. The reason I do that is because of the idea that Bowman and Briggs describe, which is those pictures, regardless of what it means in a context, even if it's something pretty simple, like we'll get into a picture on the next slide, but if that thing can be intellectualized, ripped from its original context and placed in another one based on the opinion of someone you cannot necessarily control, that can have detrimental effects on things like a job application. So that's something I definitely wanted to avoid when doing a job application. So my second interview was with one of my buddies named Will. We are both applying for jobs right now for next summer. And the question I asked him was some version of, do you really think it's important to trim social media and like make sure there's no forms of nothing that can be interpreted super rigidly or differently? And we both agree that like those things, those like the picture in the bottom right corner is a picture that he and one of we do not go to the same college, but he and one of his buddies had about, it was just a joke about making money at some poker game. But I think here something you can see is, while this may be seen as an inside joke in the moment, if it was interpreted by a job application, by a job reviewer or something like that, there are a million different ways they could review it. And I think just avoiding those ideas of contextualization and recontextualization is extremely critical in the way we apply for jobs. And I think another important thing there is at least us creating a persona that might not always be ourselves. Like the Valen Murthy that shows up to a job interview is not the same Valen Murthy you probably see after a Wednesday in class. So I think that's an extremely interesting relationship between how these terms and how things on social media can be manipulated and interpreted differently over time, and um, how avoiding those has kind of absolutely changed the way we operate and use social media in today's context. I know growing up for myself, something my parents have always told me is just make sure social media is just, while it can be something that's seen as fun and good and all those things, it just must not be something that incriminate you down the line. And I think that is, at the end of the day, is a reflection of this idea I've described here. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and good luck on finals, everybody. Bye-bye.